the notion of particulars and of the general. So if we think of something general like catness, right? The idea of a cat, then when we look at a cat that we see on the mat, that is the particular, that's the instantiation of the common, the universal. For Plato, what's more real is not the physical instantiated cat in front of you. What's more real is the universal cat, right? Now, why do we speak of a universal cat or a universal idea? Well, Plato reasoned just pretty simply that obviously what makes a cat is not that it has 4 legs, hair, 2 eyes, because a cat could lose any of those properties, right? And it still is a cat, right? You know, tabby cat, Garfield's out there running around. He gets drunk, he gets coked up, and he falls underneath Tony Soprano's Range Rover. He gets his leg run over. He owes Tony Soprano money. He doesn't pay up. Garfield gets his eye poked out, right? He's still a cat. He doesn't lose catness because Tony Soprano took his eye and his leg, because of his fiendish habits. Thus, Plato argued, the essence of cat, the idea of cat, the form of cat, cannot be identified with any of the traits, nor merely just adding the traits up. There's something else, some higher order there that is that thing. Now remember, what's an essence? The essence is that which a thing must have to be that thing and no other thing. All right. Now, with that in mind, we can come to the notion of what universals are. So universals immediately relate to the problem of the one and the many. Plato has a whole dialogue. If you've listened to the lectures as we did throughout Plato's dialogues, you will know that, well, one and many comes up often. But I think it's in Phaedo. Phaedo seems to be occupied. Yes. And I will give you some sources for all you know-it-alls out there. So you can go find the sources for the one and the many and the universals in. I had it and then I just lost my page. Where'd it go? Just read the Phaedo, first of all, but here it is. Universals and participation comes up in Phaedo. 99, 100, 101. And then out throughout the Phaedo, you'll get discussions about one and many, particularity, universality, or the forms of things. Obviously, this shouldn't be controversial, but there's always somebody who wants to harass. So Phaser goes on to say, when we look at things like roundness, redness, triangularity, etc., these are properties or features that cannot be identified with any single object, right? And obviously they have to have some reality, because if we deny that they have some reality, then we're going to run into a whole host of epistemic metaphysical problems. So abstract objects then cannot be identified or reducible to matter or the instantiations of matter. If you remember the debate with Stefan, I mean, I was just making this simple argument when I was pointing out that 7 coconuts is not the same thing as 7, obviously. Other arguments that philosophers invoke would be things like 2 + 2 = 4. Obviously, the proposition, the truth value of 2 + 2 = 4 is not identifiable to 2 rocks and 2 rocks. I mean, it's just pretty obvious that those two things are distinct. It doesn't take a whole lot of thinking power to realize that, but Philosophers will also resort to things like possible worlds, right? So if you've been in the Discord, if you've heard a lot of the argumentation that Father Deacon Dr. Ananias has given on possible worlds and how philosophers utilize possible worlds to demonstrate which things are logically impossible, then you'll know that those are examples of things that refute materialism, because materialism can't really explain how, if everything is reducible to matter, there can be arguments that are sound and valid from logic that show the impossibility of the possible worlds being reducible to matter. And there's actually a paragraph where Phaser covers that. But the first one in many argument is that universals like triangularity, redness are not reducible to any of the particulars, because anytime we talk about these things, it makes no sense to reduce the predicates that we're using to the instantiations. There must be some notion of triangularity that's not just identifiable with the secondary characteristics or features of the object in front of us. And he goes on to point out that when we look at geometry, you've heard me make this argument from Roger Penrose, comes up in the Mind of God book by Paul Davies. Mathematical principles are not invented, they're discovered. Okay, nobody invented or made up Mandelbrot sets, they were discovered. And the mathematicians who are honest that spend their lives on these topics will tell you that. They often speak this way, that they are discovering truths in the mental scape. They're not making them up, right? So this idiotic, atheistic, materialistic reductionist argument that we just make up numbers, we just make up Pythagorean theorem, they're just made up, right? As if it would work consistently over time and across cultures if they were just made up. It's ludicrous. So Phaser covers that and shows that those are examples of principles that are universal. So he lists things like numbers, universal concepts, universal propositions, laws of logic, possible worlds. These are all examples of things that are utilized that are not obviously not reducible to physical matter. Other concepts that are useful in mathematics, like zero and infinity, any of the pi, any of these things are obviously not identical to any specific thing under a microscope or any collection of molecules. He goes on to also point out the argument you've heard me make many times. This is from the Philosophy of Science. Husserl makes this argument. Science assumes the laws of logic and universals. If you heard the debate with Infidel Pharaoh that I had about a year ago, that was the summation of that whole debate. The whole debate was whether science is utilizing principles and laws for its argumentation and scientific process that are not immediately under the purview of empirical investigation. Duh, obviously it does. So then he goes on to mention the argument from the nature of possible worlds. This is the argument that Father Deacon Ananias makes, similar to it, that you can conceive of a possible world that is not reducible to matter. The laws of logic still hold. Therefore, how could you conceive of these things if all this argumentation is reducible to matter? Right? So it's just a simple way to disprove the reducibility of logic in the realm of possible worlds to matter. Then he goes on to talk about, Phaser does, about indirect argumentation. So then he goes on to say that this is the types of argument that you hear us make often as presuppositionalists, where we talk about the self-detonating nature, you could say, to quote Stefan here, the impossibility of the contrary, in the sense that when you deny universals, you put yourself in a host of problems. One of those would be the immediate claim against what's called realism. So if we're affirming an ontological reality or status, metaphysical status, to universals in some way, then we would be called a realist. Okay, there's not everybody has the same notion of realism. If you listen to last night's lecture, we talked about John Wycliffe, who was a ultra realist. He had basically a Platonic type of view. So not everybody has the same notion of realism, but just at the level of the debate here, we're just talking about whether we believe that universal concepts and universals have a a real existence, or whether they are reducible to matter, or whether they, as he lists a different position, have only a conceptual reality. And we're going to see the problem with that as well, as it falls into solipsism, becomes useless. So, but he argues that if you can think of a possible world where it's at least possible for the universals to exist, then it shows that universals are not dependent on a human mind for their existence. And so the mere possibility of them shows that they are not reducible to matter. So those are a lot of different types of arguments he gets for realism. And then he moves on to point out that if we think of general names like redness, red, etc., if you were to deny those and be a nominalist, nominalists are those who deny the reality of universal predicates or universals, then it's kind of difficult to explain what are we predicating that's in common. And the most common response from the nominalists is that, well, what we're predicating is that they just have a similarity between them. Well, that begs the question, what is it that resembles the other thing? What is it that is the similarity? Right? That's the very question that we're asked. You can't just say, well, they're similar, because that's assuming that there's a universal category that's not instantiated there. That's the point of what we're trying to argue here. And even Bertrand Russell, himself an atheist, noted the difficulty of this regress, that the resemblance argument that the nominalist often appeals to is itself a universal. Resemblance is a universal concept, and it would have to be the case for this argument to work, but then it's self-refuting. If a stop sign resembles a fire truck, since they're two different objects, then the thing that we call red has to be something more than just the instantiate, because the objects are obviously different. So to say that they share, quote, resemblance is to assume that resemblance is a real state of affairs that occurs across time and space, right? Because there's countless numbers of red objects in the world, and you're saying that the resemblance itself is consistent and adheres over time. It's invariant, right? Because redness doesn't turn into the opposite of itself in terms of the resemblance itself. And the nominalist just has to say that, well, we just don't know. Well, then the nominalist can resort to another level of moving the argument to say that, okay, well, I can avoid this dilemma by saying that we only call all of these examples resemblances merely because they resemble each other. They don't have an actual higher level existence. But this problem just moves the step to a higher level, because Fazer notes, the various cases of resemblance resemble other various cases of resemblance. So now you just said, what is the resemblance of resemblance, you see? So this higher order moving up the problem is also itself relying on a universal concept. And so this, Bertrand Russell notes, would lead to an infinite regress. The next argument you've heard me make many times, which is the linguistic argument. Language, predication, assumes universal truth predicates, right? The tree is the tree is green. What else is green? The social justice hair is green. The ice pop is green. Right? So all three of those things are green. They're different things. And when we have a sentence that's meaningful, right, for communication, if we're actually communicating in a sentence, then greenness has to be something that is really meaningful and not reducible to the breath that's coming out of my mouth, not reducible to the gray matter in my head, not reducible to the molecules in the social justice greasy hair, or in the corn syrup popsicle, or in the tree leaves. So what are we predicating here? If it's something that's not real, it doesn't exist, greenness is not real. Yeah, you see, we begin to have these ridiculous problems that now we utilize and communicate with all these things that are not real. But remember, most of the time these are atheists who don't believe in made up things. But now all language itself is just made up and therefore meaningless. When I utter the word red, Socrates utters the word red. They are obviously particular, distinct instances and utterances of the same word. Yet this word exists over and over in our utterances and in the concepts in our mind, and yet they're different minds. So therefore, there's something beyond the instantiations that allows for the conveying of meaning. Thus, words and language assume metaphysical realities. If you've been in the Discord the last week, I've probably made this point, this argument, at least 10 times with different people, different atheists bringing this up, and they don't get it. Some do. In general, it is a notoriously very difficult position to defend. Nominalism leads ultimately to the impossibility of knowledge. That's not Phaser saying that, that's me saying that. It's completely destructive to the possibility of language, meaning, knowledge, metaphysics, etc. And ultimately, when you move to the position that it's all just dependent upon a human mind, which we don't even have any to say that it depends on a human mind assumes a universal concept of mind that all minds possess. You can't even know that on this stupid position. It's a total collapse. It's totally stupid. It's really low IQ, low brain stuff. But every atheist pretty much believes this. I mean, unless you're some weird variant of a Platonic atheist, they believe this nonsense. They can't even make sentences. That's my chief argument against the atheists. If you listen, I always say, you can't make a sentence. You'll say, but yeah, I just did. Right. So that proves that your worldview is not true. That's tag right there. The argument from the objectivity of concepts and knowledge. Any objective true statement, any claim, any concept itself, such as triangularity or redness, assume that the mind has the same idea, right? For us to meaningfully communicate about any object, anything, any proposition, any sentence, we can't reduce the meaning to the gray matter because I have different gray matter, right? So how do we have, if we reduce concepts to brain states, my brain states are not your brain states. Therefore, communication would be impossible if there was not something else higher than all of the physicalist instantiations. Phaser goes on to make linguistic types of precondition arguments that you've heard me make 100 times. Consider also the many things that must be the case just for communication to be possible. This is the preconditions, transcendental argument about the possibility of communication. There's communication, and then there's a higher level of argument about what must be the case for communication to even be possible. Two different levels of argumentation. And he quotes Frege's essay, Thought. Right? So Frege has an essay, Thought, where he talks about the presuppositions of what must be the case for language to even be possible. Yes, exactly.